So during one of my middle school Wikipedia binges, I came across an article on an extinct variety of pigeon called the passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon was native to North America, and it's something I found really interesting and has never really gone away from me. I keep returning to the passenger pigeon in some capacity over the years. And today, since it's Folk Friday, I thought we should talk about this little pigeon of the past. Before the chicken rose to prominence here in North America, the passenger pigeon would have been the main way that indigenous people would have been consuming poultry. Passenger pigeon and wild turkey were the top two, depending on where you were and what time of year it was. But native people living on the continent were very careful not to disturb the bird while it was nesting for fear that it might make the birds less accessible. These birds flew in massive flocks. There were a ton of these birds around, and they flew relatively low to the ground as well, especially once they had left their nests. So you could just throw a club up into the air and get one or two. And this was the predominant way that they were being captured by indigenous people. At the height of the birds' population, it's believed there were somewhere between 3 and 5 billion of the birds in North America, and they made up to 40% of all birds living on the continent. So there were a pile of these guys. Now, once Europeans and gunpowder arrived to North America, these birds seem almost too good to be true. There are tons of these birds. Allegedly, during migratory periods, the sun could be blocked out because there are just so many pigeons in the sky at once. A single shotgun blast could take down about 5 of these birds, and there's even a record of a hunter 2 shotgun blasts taking down 61 birds. Soon contests arose around these birds, and the passenger pigeon became synonymous with sporting events. So the sustainable hunting practices of indigenous people had allowed the bird's population to remain really stable. But now that the birds were being killed for sport, the fate of the passenger pigeon was hurtling towards destruction. So extinction wasn't something that was entirely understood at the time. It appeared that the numbers of birds was pretty stable. There were still tons of adult birds. But the kicker is that when hunters would go to get these birds, largely they were in their nests. And when you disturb birds when they're nesting, it keeps them from being able to produce viable offspring. So there's still a lot of adult birds, but they're no longer producing more passenger pigeons in the numbers that they had been. In 1856, we have the first written record of a European beginning to question some of the hunting practices surrounding the passenger pigeon, and he really was questioning if this sort of thing was sustainable in the long run. He wrote that if either hunters or the passenger pigeon didn't seriously change their way of living and hunting, then there was no question in his mind that within the next 100 years, the passenger pigeon would no longer be viable, and he even wrote he wouldn't be surprised if the only way to see a passenger pigeon within the next 100 years was in a museum collection. He unfortunately would be a little too optimistic about the bird's fate. By the time the 1870s roll around, it's becoming more obvious that the birds' numbers are really dwindling. They had once been nesting all throughout North America, but now they were really only nesting around the Great Lakes. And in 1878, we had the last large nesting event in Michigan, and where birds are nesting, hunters will follow. During this nesting event, professional hunters made their way to Michigan, and numbers recorded at the time report that 50,000 birds were killed daily for 5 months. This would be the last straw for the passenger pigeon. After this event, legislation finally began to gain some attention around banning hunting of the bird, but at this time it truly was too late for the passenger pigeon. In 1897, a bill was introduced by Michigan legislature to have a 10-year hunting ban on the passenger pigeon, but unfortunately by the time this moved forward, it was just too little too late as the bird was already virtually extinct in the wild. The last recorded nest and egg were found outside of Minneapolis in 1895. A few birds straggling throughout the wild would be spotted in the following years, but all of them that have been recorded were killed to be brought to taxidermists so they could be saved for posterity. Now, by 1900, there were only 3 groups of passenger pigeons that were known to exist, and they were in zoos throughout America. There was one group in Milwaukee, another group in Chicago, and the third group was in Cincinnati. By 1909, only the birds in Cincinnati would survive, and that spring, 2 of the 3 in Cincinnati Zoo would pass away, leaving only 1 passenger pigeon left on Earth. Her name was Martha. Martha became something of a celebrity as the last of her species. An endling is also what that is called. The zoo put forward rewards if anyone could produce a passenger pigeon. Maybe someone had one in secret and they were just waiting to jump, and they were willing to pay if someone was able to bring one forward so that Martha could mate and they could continue the species. But unfortunately, no one was ever able to come forward. On September 1st of 1914, Martha was found deceased at the bottom of her enclosure. She was believed to be somewhere between 17 and 29 years old. She died of old age. Immediately, she was preserved by the zoo and then put on display, but she eventually made her way to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum's collection, where she was then put on display. She was taken off for quite some time, but in 2015, she returned to the floor, and that's where she still is today. Though the bird was numerous and relatively recent as well, they seem to have kind of fallen off the map. People, I feel like, don't talk about the passenger the same way that they talk about, like, the mammoth. And maybe that's because it doesn't have, like, the glamour of, like, the tusks, but I think that the passenger pigeon is something that we should be talking about more. Though they remain an icon in wildlife conservation and biology, they act as a reminder of just what can happen, how quickly a population can collapse and disappear if measures aren't taken to help protect the natural world. These pigeons were something that were all over North America. They were in our region as well. Meeker County, Cook County, Itasca County, and St. Louis County all have regions that are named for the passenger pigeon. There are pigeon lakes. There's a ton of pigeon lakes throughout the state. There are Pigeon River, Pigeon Point, and Pigeon Falls, all thought to have names that come from areas that pigeons were heavily populated at one point. Though the story of the passenger pigeon might not be entirely over, the de-extinction movement have had their eyes on the passenger pigeon for quite some time. Because they're relatively recently extinct and there are a lot of preserved specimens in museums, it's thought that they'll be able to completely resequence the bird's genome and then use science to reconstruct it and perhaps even have a living bird at one point with the same DNA as the extinct passenger pigeon. And even if we never have a de-extinct passenger pigeon, a lot of the science and technology that is going into these is also going forward to help animals around the precipice of extinction today, to help make those populations more genetically diverse so that populations can continue to breed and have viable offspring. But time will tell, won't it, if we have more passenger pigeons in the future. I guess I will have to leave this with a bookmark for now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful Friday, a great weekend. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.